As we begin, I would like to acknowledge that Portland State University is located in the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Kathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and other indigenous peoples of the river known as Wimal, Nichiwana, and Columbia. We are grateful to be guests on these lands. Acknowledging territory shows recognition of and respect for indigenous peoples, both past and present. Recognition and respect are essential elements of establishing healthy, reciprocal relationships and developing a sense of place. This is a critical time to emphasize that humans and the environment are inextricably connected, especially during the global COVID-19 pandemic and while wildfires, landslides, and floods threaten health and safety here in Portland and across the US West. Indigenous relationships with their ancestral lands can help folks recognize how humans and the environment are one. Let us work together to honor their lives and ancestors, their descendants, and our own heritage. Welcome. So today we are about to embark on part 3 of our speaker series, which is sponsored to you by Emergency Management and Community Resilience Program in Portland State and the Initiative for Community and Disaster Resilience in the Center for Public Service. This speaker series is meant to highlight the faculty in our new EMCR program and to provide an introduction on what Portland State has to offer in this area. I'm very excited to share with everybody today about our program. This is a very significant day, being the anniversary of the March 11th Japanese tsunami, earthquake, and anthropogenic disaster. It's also the day that Oregon is premiering its Shake Alert, or early warning earthquake system, which I'll talk about in a second. Both of these reinforce the importance of us learning about lessons from hazards and disasters and responding to them. As part of this, Portland State has initiated a new master's, graduate, and non-credit degree program in order to respond to these timely events that are happening around us, from the Cascadia quake to the emerging wildfires and the COVID-19 pandemic. This degree was created to envision an equitable future for the emergency management field that focuses on community resilience. We are one of the only programs in the United States that focuses on both emergency management and community resilience as its primary objective. And this year is the year that we are rolling out all of these programs at this appropriate time in history. Our master's degree offers the opportunity for our students to take a core curriculum that comes from 6 different disciplines and is fed by over 15 disciplines that offer 120 different electives. We also have various community-based partners where our students will get real-world experience in the classroom and meet practitioners, as well as build a network of professionals that they can then be part of as they move through our program and into the professional world. In addition, we offer a certificate program that's 18 credits of our core curriculum, where students will get the best of our core curriculum, which is transdisciplinary across the 6 different disciplines, and also be able to enhance their work while they're continuing their education, or when coming back to try and get a specialization to move into the emergency management field. Our faculty conducts research both locally and globally in all aspects of the disaster risk management cycle, which means that we engage relief, recovery, mitigation, and preparedness in various ways in our region and across the world. And all of our students get a taste of this, which is what we're now featuring in the speaker series. This speaker series will also live on into the future, so please join us monthly, and we will have practitioners talking about what it's like to work in the field of emergency and disaster management, and what it's like for our students to be training to be the next generation to serve that field. Currently, our application for the degree programs are open until May 31st. That's the certificate and the master's degree. And I also want to highlight that our non-degree professional certificate, which is aimed at community members to enhance their understanding of the emergency management field in the business sector, nonprofits, neighborhood advisory, and also folks who are already involved in this and would like to get more, but don't have the time to go to a graduate program or take the additional classes that we have for the certificate and the degree, our non-degree professional certificate is for you. And this is offered starting April 9th, and we will take applications all the way through April 8th. And you will get a taste of our core curriculum from faculty that are also speaking today about what we have to offer our community in the field of emergency management and community resilience. Please check out our links for all of those. They will be put in the chat now for our master's program, for our graduate certificate, and our non-degree professional certificate, which starts April 9th. So we would love to have you in any of our programs, and to be sure that folks see how Portland State is responding in this critical time of need to the hazards that are in front of us. So please join us for this journey. Thank you for that. Next, what I want to share today is that today is the rollout of Shake Alert. And I spoke to our expert faculty member, Scott Burns, who gave me a little bit of information that I thought you might find interesting about Shake Alert. Today at 10 a.m., you will automatically have the new Shake Alert system installed onto your phone. It is part of the early warning system already on the phones, similar to the Amber Alerts that you already have. If a large earthquake occurs in the Pacific Northwest, it will tell you to drop, cover, and hold because a large quake has occurred. If you want to have it be more accurate, download the Quake Alert USA app. We'll put that in the chat. That app is tied to the system and will tell you where the epicenter of the earthquake is and how much time you have until the S wave with all of the energy arrives. The first alert you get is based on the P wave, which has very little energy and shaking. Why is this app so important? If Cascadia breaks from one end to the other, a magnitude 9 quake every 500 years, we will have only a couple of seconds to drop, cover, and hold. But if the southern margin of Cascadia only goes off about every 250 years, based on previous research, it will produce an 8 magnitude on the southern margin, and we will have 2 to 3 minutes of warning. We can get out of our elevators, out of our buildings, off of our bridges. Scott Burns loves this app. Okay, so just wanted you to hear about the Shake Alert. So let's now turn to today's talk. Learn from the Japanese earthquake and tsunami crisis by Dr. Masami Nishishiba and Dr. Hiro Ito. Masami Nishishiba is department chair and professor of public administration at the Marco Hatfield School of Government at PSU. She is also associate director of the Center for Public Service and acting director of the Nonprofit Institute at the Hatfield School of Government. She co-directs the Initiative for Community Disaster Resilience, which brings you this speaker series today, housed within the Center for Public Service. Her interests include diversity, equity, inclusion, civic engagement, intercultural communication, comparative local government, research design, and program evaluation. She completed her doctorate in public administration and policy at PSU and her master's degree in communication studies at PSU. And she holds a bachelor's in linguistics from Osaka University in Japan. Dr. Hiro Ito is professor of economics at PSU. His areas of focus are financial crisis, emerging market, open macro policies, and globalization. Ito received his PhD and MA in economics from the University of California at Santa Cruz, go Banana Slugs, and MA in International Relations from the Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies of Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C. He holds a BA in law also from Waseda University. It is my pleasure to bring you today Dr. Nishishiba and Dr. Hiro. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. So why don't I share my screen now? Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Again, this is Hiro Ito, and thank you very much for coming to this event. And as Jeremy said, this is exactly the 10th year anniversary since Japan was hit by a massive earthquake and tsunami in 2011. And that disaster killed about 22,000 people and destroyed so many houses and other buildings and people's lives. So today, myself and Professor Nishishiba will talk about this disaster that happened in Tohoku. Then I'm going to spend the first half of the presentation talking about what happened and how Tohoku is doing at this point. And in the second half, Professor Nishishiba is going to talk about this disaster from the view of local governance and social capital. Okay, so let me start my portion. And Tohoku, the word Tohoku means northeast. And as you can see, it is located in the northeast part of Japan. And the biggest city in the Tohoku region is called Sendai. And this is the closest city to the epicenter of the earthquake, whose magnitude was 9.0 that happened on March 11th, 2011. Okay. So then I'm going to talk about what happened in the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. But before I give you some information, I just want you to watch some videos. And some of the videos or some of the scenes in the videos may not be comfortable to some people. So I'm going to show about 5 minutes of these videos. So if you think you don't feel comfortable watching them, please turn off the screen for 5 minutes or so. Then after 5 minutes, I'll come back to the non-video screen. Okay. So let's watch the videos. All right. Okay, sorry. So a TV crew, I hope you can watch the video now. The TV crew, a local TV crew happened to be at somebody's house and interviewing a mom and kids. Then the earthquake happened at 2:46 p.m. on March 11th. Japan uses Shindo scale. Shindo 7 is the highest level of shaking and Shindo 1 is the lowest. And the earthquake that happened on March 11th marked Shindo 7, which is the highest. So in Shindo 7 environment, you cannot keep standing. Then you just have to see all the objects just falling on the floor or on the ground. Okay. The second video is showing Kesenuma, which is a small fishery town. Then you can see that the downtown area, which is about a few miles away from the sea line, coastline, started being inundated. And tsunami occurred about 45 minutes after the first wave of earthquake happened. So many people evacuated to some buildings, and I think they are watching the flood or tsunami from the third floor. Then you can see that the level of water keeps rising and getting closer to where they are. They're trying to go to the roof of the building because the water level is rising. The last one. This is showing the downtown of the city of Ishinomaki. And the city got inundated. And Ishinomaki ended up having the largest number of deaths per capita among the cities affected, the towns affected by the earthquake and tsunami. Tsunami came in several waves, and some say it lasted for 1 hour or so. Okay, so these are the videos. And yes, about 22,000 people were killed because of this disaster. And before moving on, I'd like us to observe a moment of silence to commemorate those who lost their lives. Mokto. Okay, back to the presentation. So again, the earthquake and tsunami are just massive. And it is more of the tsunamis that very much destroyed all the towns. So the height of the tsunami was as high as about 70 feet. Then the tsunami coming from the ocean went against the river and then reached to higher places. Then some higher places were as high as 130 feet. So you can see how much inundation took place. Then the tsunami event was followed by the nuclear meltdown at Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. So people call this disaster the triple crisis. This figure shows the number of earthquakes by month. And as you can see, before the March of 2011, the number of earthquakes for a month was about 75 cases or so. Then it jumps up to 600, then followed by a high number of earthquakes for some time until 2012 or so. So this is consistent with what scientists said, because they said that aftershocks are expected to last for a century or so. And as a matter of fact, last month on February 13th, the same region, the Tohoku region, experienced a 7.3 magnitude 7.3 earthquake. And it was considered to be an aftershock of the 3/11 earthquake. So one point I'd like to emphasize here is that unlike flooding or wildfires, not wildfire, but unlike flooding, earthquake is not just a one-time event. So it usually involves some aftershocks. Then the buildings that are not completely destroyed in the first wave of earthquakes can be destroyed even more because of aftershocks. And then people in America, we tend not to have so much ideas about how it is to be in an earthquake, in a place where earthquake hits. But what we really have to be careful is the aftershocks. So the economic cost was very high. It was about $225 billion. It was a sum of the economic sizes of Iwate, Miyagi, and Fukushima. Those are the prefectures that are severely damaged by the earthquake and tsunami. And this cost was the world's biggest, in the human history in terms of the economic cost. Then, as I said, 16,000 people died and 2,500 people are still missing, and 402,000 homes were destroyed. And there was a severe power outage in the immediate aftermath of the crisis. About 8 million units lost their power. And then still, as of now, 470,000 people living in the evacuated place. So there are 470,000 evacuees as of now, which is quite high. But at the same time, about 70% or so of these 470,000 evacuees are the evacuees in Fukushima because of the nuclear power meltdown. And this slide shows you the causes of death. But before that, you can see that those who are 60 years old or older account for more than 60% of the deaths. So which means that there are a lot of old people who had a hard time escaping from the tsunami, and they ended up losing their lives. Then, as you can see, if you look at the causes of death, drowning accounts for more than 90%. Then those who are killed by the earthquake accounts only for 4.2% or so. So which means that Japan's building code was pretty good. So the direct damage from the earthquake was relatively minor, but most of the people died because of the tsunami. Then there's another category called disaster-related deaths. So those deaths refer to people who lost their lives indirectly because of the disaster. For example, if you are on a medical treatment, but you became an evacuee, then you lost access to some medical treatment, therefore you lost your lives. And this kind of a death can be counted as disaster-related deaths. Also, as I show you, a lot of people lived in temporary housing units. Then those housing units are quite tiny. Then some people got worse in their health conditions because of living in there for a long time. Then those people who died because of that kind of reason are also counted part of disaster-related deaths. So in total, about 22,000 people lost their lives. So what happened after the disaster? Well, soon after the disaster, the self-defense force was sent by the central government to the crisis-afflicted area. Then also the US military came to help the efforts. So there was an operation called Operation Tomodachi. That was a very much collaboration between the self-defense force in Japan and the US military. Then this operation was very much appreciated. As a matter of fact, before the disaster, there are some political issues between Japan and the US in terms of the US military bases in Japan. There was a strong opposition to US military bases, but the Operation Tomodachi almost wiped that image. Then the US military was very much welcomed by the people in Tohoku and also the rest of Japan. And those people engaged in clearing debris, and the amount of debris was quite humongous. It was about the same as more than 20 years worth of household waste in these prefectures. These prefectures means Iwate, Miyagi, and Fukushima. And the amount of debris was 23 million tons. So that was quite a bit of debris. It needed to be cleaned up. But clearing debris was done more quickly than many people thought. So it was quite impressive, looked quite impressive to many people. And speaking of people, many people lived in temporary housing units after the disaster while they're waiting for their new homes or apartments to be constructed. And you can see the pictures of temporary housing units. So yes, these are supposed to be temporary, and technically those buildings are supposed to last for 2 years. but many people lived there for more than 7 or 8 years. And as of now, there are still some people, about 1,000 or so, living in temporary housing units. Then by the end of this year, the number of those who are living in housing units, temporary housing units, will be 0, except for Fukushima. Then the government also designated certain areas as inundated areas. And those inundated areas are supposed to be legally uninhabitable so that people cannot live, so that those people have to relocate themselves to higher levels. So some communities relocated to higher levels, and the government also created housing and residential areas for them. And in many of the areas, community relocation took place on unanimous basis among the people who belong to a certain community. So the consensus building took so many years. And that is one of the reasons why it took so many years for those people who live in the temporary housing units to move to their new homes. Here's some pictures from a town called Rikuzen Takata. And as you can see, there is a lot of constructions going on almost everywhere. Then people are re-elevating the grounds so that they can be more resilient to tsunami. And then above the elevated or re-elevated grounds, people working to construct to residential areas, to create residential areas and commercial areas. And they also worked on building or reinforcing seawalls or levees. And the height of the levees for many parts of the levee lines was supposed to be around 40 feet because the government thought that this height is high enough to be resilient against once in 100 years tsunami. And if you have a chance to go to Tohoku, then if you go see the ocean, you see a lot of levees almost everywhere. Then building those levees were to some extent controversial as well, because some people wanted to be done as quickly as possible so that they can feel safer. And some other people quite uncomfortable about building seawalls or levees because it just obstructs the view. And also for some people, especially fishermen, the ocean means a lot for those people. Then they have to have their access to the ocean quite limited because of the sea levees. So despite the controversies, now you see a lot of high levees along the coastlines in Tohoku. So it's been more than 10 years since the disaster happened. Physical reconstruction is more or less done. When I say physical reconstruction, that means constructing seawalls or residential buildings and commercial areas and re-elevating land and so forth. So if you had a chance to go to Tohoku 2-3 years ago, you saw lots of construction sites. They're just everywhere. But now the number of constructions seems to be much lower, and you see fewer reconstruction efforts. But people are still working on to kind of adjusting to new lives. So many people are now started living in the new residential buildings and areas, but they have to rebuild their own local communities. That can be quite tough. Then how tough building local communities can be is something Professor Nishishiba will talk about. But what I want to say here is that physical construction is more or less done, but the mental or psychological recovery or readjustment have been going on still. A couple of years ago, when Jeremy had a presentation, he talked about that natural disasters often make some underlying socioeconomic or economic issues on the surface. And that's what we observed in the case of Tohoku as well. Even before the Tohoku disaster, the area was having problems with aging population, depopulation, and the lack of industries. In some areas in Tohoku, the proportion of people, those who are older than 65 years old, account for as high as 40% of the total population in the town. So that's quite a bit of old people. Then young people tend to migrate to city areas, leaving their parents or grandparents behind. Part of the reasons for that is because the industries are not there for them. So there's a vicious cycle of aging population, depopulation, and lack of industries, and that were in the case even before the Tohoku disaster. Then now, Tohoku is at the stage of reconstructing and renovating communities, and they're facing these issues. For example, if you're trying to plan a neighborhood or commercial area, you have to have some assumptions about how big the customer population would be. Okay, but if you're facing shrinking, if you're facing a place with a shrinking population, you may wonder how to, calculate or project the number of population in the future. And also more crudely, what is the point of reconstructing an area if the area of concern is shrinking? So that kind of problem is still a big issue for many local communities in Tohoku. And there's also an issue in terms of governance related to post-disaster reconstructions. Because even now there's relatively hierarchical and rigid relationship between the central government in Tokyo and the local governments. And there were some clash between the two. Then that also affected some parts of the reconstruction efforts. So, but this issue is another issue Professor Nishishiba is going to talk about. So let's leave it to her. And the last issue I want to emphasize is that Japan is not having a huge issue with income inequality, which is quite different from the United States. So that means that there is not so much resentment against certain segments of the population. So it's not like those who have nots are quite angry about the lives of those who have. So that kind of issue was not so much of a case in Japan in general, and still it's not. So that creates an atmosphere where people can be kind of cooperative with each other and helping each other. So there's a strong sense that people in Tohoku or in Japan in general, they're in the same boat. Then they're facing the same kind of issue. So let's try to weather and overcome these issues all together. So I think that that kind of peaceful feeling can come because of the fact that income issue is not such a big issue in Japan. So in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake and tsunami, there was no riotings or looting. So if there's some rationing of food, people are lining up and waiting for their turn very patiently and very quietly. So that is unfortunately different from what we saw at the time of Katrina in 2005, for example. So the fact that Japan is not facing a severe income inequality issue seems to have helped the Tohoku's reconstruction efforts. And that is something we have to be very much careful about the post-crisis situation in the United States if something happens. Okay. So this is my last slide for me. So why don't I pass this to Professor Nishishiba. Thank you very much.
The next slide, please.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Hiro. So now that Professor Ito has presented the general overview of the pre-11 disaster in Tohoku, in the latter part of this presentation, we would like to kind of focus our attention on post-3/11 and share our observation of what is happening in Japan and Tohoku, and also some of the key lessons that we may be able to apply in us thinking about how we move from the incident to recovery. The slide you are looking at is from Blackman, Nakanishi, and Benson. They applied the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction 2015-2030 and looked at how things will move from the incident towards the recovery. Many of you may be aware of the disaster management cycle that goes from incident to response to recovery to mitigation to preparation. This kind of model kind of zoom into what happens between the response to recovery and kind of identifies what happens during those short-term phase right after the incident, and then the long-term phase thinking towards recovery. So as you can see in this slide, relief, what they say relief includes the rescue, some kind of an immediate emergency response type of activities. And then after the relief phase is over, then it goes into a rehabilitation phase where the temporary settlement happens, some of the repair of damaged facility, reconstruction happens. And then at this phase, the prioritization of activities such as attending schools for returning to the normalcy will take place. And then the long-term phase is the recovery. And so in the recovery phase, people will have a permanent settlement, the community development effort will be in place, some of the renewal will take place, and mostly the capacity development will happen and people will try to return to normalcy. Now, what is important that particularly this Blackman, Nakanishi, and Benson emphasizes is to think very carefully what we do from the short-term to the long-term phase in this transition. And the way we see what is happening in Tohoku and Japan is that they have had a very long, prolonged period of this transition phase. Some places and some communities may be more in the phase of recovery, but some places may still be trying to figure out the transitioning from the rehabilitation to recovery. Now, in this transition phase, there are three things that has the potential largest impact to the recovery. One thing is the emergence of new actors and new leaders. The second thing is the development of social capital. And then the third thing is to emphasize on the cooperation. And we will present on each one of those. The presentation that we are doing here is based on our observation of the field trip class that Professor Ito and I led in 2017, 18, and 19. We took a group of students and practitioners from Portland and Oregon area to Tohoku. And that's where we observe what's happening and that's where we talk to the people in the community. And by the way, this field trip class will be part of the elective of the class that Jeremy mentioned in our degree programs. One more thing to comment on this slide is that if you think about who would be taking the leadership or having the responsibility in kind of setting the direction. In the relief phase, the local community is disaster stricken, and therefore it is very difficult for them to take the leadership and initiative. And therefore, typically in the relief phase, some higher level authorities such as the central government can be more effective in guiding the direction. However, moving from the relief to rehabilitation, still the rehabilitation phase, the national government or central government, or in the case of the United States federal government, may be in a better position to take action. However, this is the phase that is important to start engaging the local community. And then as we move from transition to recovery phase, it becomes more and more important to have the local community taking the leadership role and setting the direction. Okay, next slide, please. So earlier, Professor Ito mentioned that one of the underlying issues surrounding Tohoku was the hierarchical relationship between the central government and local government in Japan. This is a very simplified illustration of the comparison between US and Japan and in its authority and functional relationship among the different levels of government. I will not go into the detail, but the idea is that unlike the United States, where we have a federal system and the state and local governments have more autonomy, Japan, with its national system, the central government has a very strong authority and control over prefectures and municipalities that constitute the local government. There have been numerous attempts to decentralize this system and delegate more authorities to local government. However, in practice, in Japan, central government still holds a very high level of authority and control. The authority in terms of implementing the policy and control also includes the fiscal, the financial control. And as a result of this long hierarchical relationship, there is a sense of dependency among the local governments and the community to seek guidance from the central government. And also the local government and local community may not have enough skill and capacity to make decisions and implement projects on their own. And as a consequence, again, this system of top-down hierarchical control by the central governments sustain itself. So this sort of a hierarchical command and control relationship between the national government and local government became an issue in the local community from the rehabilitation moving towards recovery. Because in the rehabilitation stage, national government started to come up with a one-size-fits-all type of approaches to many of the reconstruction efforts without taking into account the needs of the local community. Hiro mentioned that if you go to Tohoku, you will see numerous long levees or seawalls. And the example of that, or the example of the national government putting in a one-size-fits-all is the seawall. in many communities, despite the fact that, as Hiro mentioned, it is controversial, the community requests or community needs were not incorporated, but the central government kind of parachute in and sort of commanded what should be done, and the Shiro was built. Also, during this time period, the national government put in lots and lots of money for the recovery effort. And the local government, in a way, had no say because they were dependent on those financial support from the local government. So there's a lot more in detail to explain about how this governance structure influenced the recovery effort towards recovery, but I would like to move on. Next slide. So I mentioned in explaining the input, what happens during the transition phase is that the emergence of new actors and emergence of new leaders. Now, in Japan, the nonprofit sector emerged as the new actors after the 1995 Kobe earthquake. This 1995, right after the 1999 Kobe earthquake, many people started to self-organize and volunteer to help the relief effort, rehabilitation effort, and even now for the recovery effort. And that emergence of volunteerism was formalized by putting in the law to promote the nonprofit activities. And between 2000 and 2008, there was some major legal reform took place to allow the nonprofit organizations to be a leading actor in some of those situations. Next slide. So as you can see, after the law passed to recognize some nonprofit organization as a certified nonprofit organization, then the number of the nonprofit organization increased. And also, as you can see, after 2011, the number of nonprofit organizations increased drastically. And they have been playing numbers of important roles in the response, reconstruction, and now the community building efforts in Tohoku. Okay, the next slide, please. Also, in the transition phase, another thing that we have to sort of pay attention to is the emergence of new leaders. During our field trip to Tohoku, we've met numbers of those emerging leaders who led the community from the response and now working to develop the community and taking an important leadership. In the interest of time, I am going to briefly introduce a couple of people we met as an example of an emerging leaders in Tohoku area. The first person I would like to introduce is Mr. Tomoyuki Miura. He is from the city of Hisenuma that you also saw in the video. He himself lost his house and also he lost his mother from the tsunami. Now, so during the evacuation phase, he was in this evacuation shelter, And he sort of organically started to coordinate some of the people in that shelter and organize the activities. He mentioned that people in the shelter prefer to have some kind of a structure. And so by somebody taking a leadership to kind of provide a structure and identifying the roles that people can play in the shelter, that in and of itself gives people some encouragement and the sense of purpose while they are in the shelter. And so he organized the shelter, and then after this immediate relief phase, and once he kind of got out of the evacuation shelter and moved into some not a temporary house, but some sort of home, then he started to work for several non-profit organizations that had a focus on rehabilitation and recovery efforts. So that experience working in the non-profit gave him a lot of opportunity to have a reach to a variety of different communities. Now, one of the contributions he made was to organize a community discussion over the seawall. So his effort, not just his effort, but this community's effort, the Old Tiny Coastline, is seen as one of the most exemplary process that community took in having a discussion and making a decision over whether to build the seawall or not. So this area, this community, as we mentioned, the central government designated that they should be building a gigantic seawall. Now, as Hiro mentioned earlier, there was a controversy. Some people prefer to maintain the natural beauty and wanting to maintain their community where they can see the coastline from their house. They wanted to maintain the connection to the ocean. Another group of people, they are very concerned about the next earthquake and tsunami, and they said that it is imperative to have a seawall to assure our safety. And so, left alone, those two groups would create a very disruptive community. Now, what Mr. Miura did was started to organize a study session. So the idea is that he wanted to provide a neutral place where people who are pro-seawall, people who are con-seawall can learn about what is involved in the development of the seawall. So it is not value-driven, but it is more objective. And in the process of organizing the study session on the seawall, he and his group facilitated the community conversation on what exactly is the ideal community. And the community agreed that even people who want a seawall or people who doesn't want a seawall, the higher level role is the same. The higher level role of those people in the community is to develop a livable community. The livable community that is safe and livable community that has the access to the ocean. So what he did was he tried to put those two people together, have them focus on the shared goal, and then come up with an alternative option to the seawall that would satisfy both groups. So at the end, they resulted in a proposal to develop a highway across the coastal line on the raised ground that can function as a Hiro at the time of tsunami. And because it is a highway or the road, it does not totally cut out the access of the people in the community to the coastal line. And after multiple negotiations with the national government, he and the community members were able to move forward with their proposal. With all that effort, he was elected to the city council in 2018, and he is still working on the community development effort. Next slide, please. The second person that I would like to introduce as a new leader is Mr. Ken Sato. This person, Ken, he owned a bar and he was a bartender at the bar called Blue Jam before 3/11 disaster. And he was affected by the earthquake and the tsunami, and he had to sort of evacuate. Now, he himself has a toddler, and in the evacuation site, he noticed that many young mothers, particularly with people who have newborns, was having a really hard time trying to sort of feed their babies, get the potential milk, and also even to find a safe place to breastfeed the babies. And he felt like if somebody doesn't do anything, then the babies will die. And he said, as a human being, I cannot let this happen. And so he started to organize a way to kind of make sure that people, the young mothers will have a supply of milk, supply of diaper, and also even mobilize the government to have powder, not the powder milk, the regular milk being supplied to those young mothers. After the 3/11, he also recognized that those young mothers need continued support, and also it is important to provide a place of employment for the people who became a victim during this disaster. And so he started a jam business in 2011 October. He brought the community members, particularly mothers, and the mothers will come to this place where they can kind of together make jam while they are watching their toddlers right there, and that became their place of employment. And then, one thing led to the other, and he started to kind of expand this business, and namely Peace Jam, not the root jam as the bar, but Peace Jam, and expanded the business to include other baby products, and also started to develop a facility where the young mothers and the toddlers and the babies can come and spend time together with their family. And his effort has been recognized by the national government. He was elected as a committee member for Hasenuma Community Development Council in 2014, and he is still being active, contributing in the community. So there are multiple numbers of those community leaders that we observe who emerged during the transition phase. Next slide, please. So the second thing during the transition phase that we have to pay attention to is about the social capital. Next slide, please. So social capital is the kind of resources and the capital that the community develops based on the relationship among the people or the network of the people and organization. The more people have a relationship or in a tight relationship with a higher trust, you would say that it has a higher social capital. Less relationship, less cohesiveness in the community, less social capital. Now, many communities in Japan, particularly in the areas where the tsunami hit, already had existing social capital. It has a long history and it has a lot of kind of strong ties and networks among the people. However, the disaster will destroy those existing social capitals, partially because of the death, partially because of the relocation of the people in the community. Also, one of the things that is important for people to develop the relationship is to have an activities and facilities to conduct an activities, and those are gone. So the social capital, the disaster will destroy the existing social capital. However, after the incident, and particularly what is important to pay attention to is to think about how to develop the new social capital in the community. And when we think about the new social capital, there are three types of social capital that we need to think about. Bonding capital is more kind of an inward-looking relationship. So the capital among peers, capital among family and close friends and neighborhoods. Those are bonding capital. Bridging capital is a little bit more on the outward-looking networks. So bridging capital means you develop a relationship and network across different groups, across the prefecture, across different communities. And then the linking social capital is the social capital that will mitigate the vertical divide. Now, those three sort of social capitals are emerging, but also some are problematic right now in Japan. So, for example, there is a new town called Yamagata town. And in order to bring people back to this community, they made sort of effort to give incentives to the people coming from other areas to this newly developed town, particularly the people who have young children. Gave a lot of incentives, financial incentives, and a lot of people came and they loved that town. However, according to the community leaders in that area, they are very concerned that the bonding capital is still not developing. So people who move in from other areas to this newly developed community, they are now forming the network and the relationship. And that seems to have become a little problematic at the last February earthquake that Hiro mentioned. Not much of an information exchange happened within the community. So now they are really looking into the ways to develop the bonding capital. Bridging capital, like it says here, the disaster and Tohoku facilitated the collaboration across different regions of Japan, and in some ways, the bridging capital is sort of facilitated by those kind of a government to government collaboration. Some of the effort to link, to develop a linking capital is taken up by the nonprofit organizations by trying to kind of support people who have a difficulty in the lower socioeconomic status. Next slide, please. So the last thing in the transition phase that we have to pay attention to is the importance of co-production. Next slide. And so I mentioned upfront that in the relief phase and partially in the rehabilitation phase, typically things can be done top-down. But if we were to have a long-term sustainable recovery, it is important to empower the community, and that calls for an approach to have a co-production with multiple people sitting at the table as equal partners. And so I briefly mentioned about the effort that Mr. Miller led in developing the Hiro. That was one of the success stories where the community members stand up and try to be more of an equal partner with the national government so they can be a partner in co-producing the solution for the tsunami protection. So those are some of those observations that we made. And I think I will wrap up at this point so people can have some questions. And there are many, many things happening still in Tohoku. And one of the things that recently was reported by the newspaper by interviewing the local residents was that this person was saying that when you look at the physical recovery, many of our towns have new buildings, new roads, and it looks like a new place. However, at the core of the people living there, it is very difficult for us to feel and understand what recovery means unless we all kind of understand the kind of feeling that people went through this process. And I think that is an important aspect that we all have to pay attention to. Thank you. Dr. Jeremy.
Thank you, Masami and Hiro. Hiro, can you stop sharing your screen?
Okay.
I will share mine. All right, thank you to everybody for a really informative talk. That was awesome. We're gonna have a question and answer session now. And if I can ask you to put your questions and answers in the Q&A box, not in the chat box, and I will read some of the questions and have our wonderful speakers respond. I failed to introduce any of us at the beginning of the talk. I'm the director of the Emergency Management and Community Resilience degree program. And Dr. Nishishiba and Dr. Hiro are co-directors of the ICDR initiative, the Initiative for Community and Disaster Resilience in the Center for Public Service at PSU. All right, let's get this Q&A going. How do you think the COVID work from home will impact future recovery efforts?
I guess the question is about Japan.
Yep.
Not in general.
Yeah, just about Japan, I think.
Yeah. First of all, the case of COVID in Japan, especially in Tohoku, is not as severe as it is in the United States. So since last March, schools have been open, and you know, if you go to downtown, you may feel that there are fewer people walking on the street, but still you see people shopping, window shopping, and so forth. But at the same time, one of the biggest issues that Japan needs to come over is the digitization of doing business or dealing with some governmental administrative documents and so forth. And that also includes the way kids are being taught as well. So frankly, I mean, in short, in Japan, working from home is not as prevalent as in the United States. And one of the reasons is because there's a stronger culture that appreciates in-person communication, especially in business, and also second of all, the digitization in the workplace and also schools has been quite underdeveloped. So now the government is trying to build a new agency called the Agency of Digitization, and really trying to make everything easier to do online. And I think, what COVID did to Japan is to make Japanese people realize the importance of, digitizing things. So in that sense, I think that the way people communicate with each other may change because of the COVID experience.
Another thing is that Japan at large and also Tohoku area was sort of relying on the tourism boom stimulated by the Tokyo Olympics will help the recovery. But with the Olympics being cancelled and also the prospect of not sure whether people can bring in the tourists in any of those regions is expected to affect the economic recovery of all over Japan, but also the Tohoku region.
Thank you both for those responses. Our next question, I'm going to summarize the beginning of it. In light of experiences in Japan, Chile, Alaska, and other subduction zones that have had large magnitude historical earthquakes, and that we know that their buildings are in the inundation zone, are very high risk. How do we move back toward policy that minimizes risk and increases resiliency when politics counter these arguments in favor of beachside development? Has Japan dealt with these types of issues? You both mentioned controversy over the seawalls. How was this overcome? How do we move forward in Oregon?
Okay. I think one good example is the earthquake or disaster insurance, because there's a disaster myopia, which means people tend to underestimate the probability of experiencing a disaster in their lifetime. So, if they have that kind of way of thinking, then that they tend to, look lightly at experiencing a disaster. So then the government's role is to, provide more information and then have people more ready for disaster. So in the case of Japan, since Japan is an island country, it is exposed to many, many natural disasters. So in that sense, relatively speaking, the disaster myopia can be a little bit less in Japan because they are constantly exposed to natural disasters. But at the same time, what is interesting about human behavior is that if they're exposed to too much, then they may have different kind of disaster myopia. So for example, I was in Tokyo when March 11th earthquake happened. So in the beginning, I thought that it's going to be another earthquake, because, just by the feeling, I think that you can experience 3 or 4 earthquakes a month. So you are very much used to experiencing it. So in that sense, you are so much used to, then if something happens, then you tend to think in Japan, the government is there to help you. So coming back to this issue of earthquake, disaster myopia and also immediate government reaction tend to have people less people to sign up for disaster insurance. So I think fighting myopia is quite a difficult issue for any country.
And I agree that trying to persuade the policymakers to stand on the side of disaster mitigation and make the decision is a hard thing. And even in Japan, I just listened to an interview by Ken Sato, who I just introduced, on his thoughts about what is necessary for the future of the town of Kasenuma. And to my surprise, he said, I want people to be more aware of the impact of disaster. And I was like, he is in Kasenuma, and how can the people in Kasenuma not be aware of the disaster? And he noted that people are building houses near the coastal line where can potentially be affected by the tsunami. And he says, we have to think about if we make a short-term decision that will result in the grief and the sadness of our future generation, that means we are not learning any lessons from the past. And that word really kind of struck me. And he says he wants people to think about what is the impact of your immediate decision weighing the economic advantage versus disaster safety. What is the impact not just to you, but to the future generation? And it's hard, but that I just wanted to introduce his words.
And just one more issue. As I said, there was a big aftershock in February in Japan. The magnitude was 7.3, but the number of casualties is just one. One person died from a magnitude 7.3 earthquake. That's quite good. So that means that the building codes are functioning in Japan, and many buildings are very much resilient. But at the same time, if you look at the history of building codes in Japan, major revisions take place every time there's a huge earthquake. So after the Kobe earthquake, there's a big revision in the building code. Then after the 2011 earthquake, there's another major revision of the building code. So that means even Japan, it seems to be kind of backward looking. They're trying to prepare more only after they experience something really severe and big.
What wonderful points. Thank you. Your next question is coming from a neighborhood emergency team volunteer in Portland, and they'd like to know, in Japan, is there a role for non-affiliated community volunteers doing autonomous mutual aid, or is disaster aid and relief primarily managed top-down, as Dr. Nishishiba Sensei discussed?
There are a lot of volunteer firefighters in Japan, all over Japan, and they can be first responders as well. And then at the same time, there's local governments, firefighters, and other first responders. So both types work at the time of disaster.
And as far as I know, the self-organized neighborhood kind of volunteers, I don't think they are allowed to provide the so-called first aid. They can participate in the rescue effort, but one thing that I noticed was those volunteers are in a way more structured, and in a way it is more mandatory that each neighborhood have organized the system for people to volunteer in the event of disaster. And so each sort of a neighborhood association will hold the disaster training on a regular basis. And each one of the households, for example, my mom has like a helmet And, so they are a little bit more organized and educated, but I don't think that they are allowed to provide the medical first aid.
And also they are not allowed to touch dead bodies either. So whenever they find dead bodies, they have to call the police. Then only the police are allowed to deal with dead bodies. And another thing is that after the tsunami, most of the roads are just clogged because of all the fallen trees and so forth. And many volunteer firefighters didn't have large equipment to cut the trees and also to clear the debris and recreate roads. So that's another reason why they called for the self-defense forces so that they can clear the roads.
Did you find any examples of informal mutual aid groups, like folks getting together through a civic organization or religious organization to provide some form of relief or recovery?
In Japan, usually schools, gymnasiums become the evacuation center. Mm-hmm. Then that's where non-profit organizations, people from NPOs come, and then they provide that kind of services.
That makes sense. Were there any kinds of non-disaster municipal planning from before 3/11 that proved to be especially useful during the recovery?
That's a hard question. So the disaster planning before 3/11 that turned out to be useful after.
Yep.
I think the top-down structure Professor Nishishiba was talking about, as she said, it can cause some problems, but at the same time, it can make a kind of sense of unity. Then it can facilitate collaboration and cooperation among different units. So, that kind of sense of belonging to a certain group was strong in most of the towns, and that helped.
And so, each one of the local government has an obligation to develop a disaster plan. And so every one of those places that was given have had a disaster plan. However, I think none of those disaster plans had the assumption of the scope of this 3/11 type of disaster would hit. It was beyond the past, beyond their imagination. And so because of that, from what I understand is that many of the plan may not have had the effectiveness as they expected. But bits and pieces of the plan worked. So when the disaster hit, then, for example, the municipal government have a really kind of organized way to inform who is going to be where and do what. And so when the disaster hit, the staff members who can take that action did take that action and help some of the people. So that's why I say it is a little hard to say that what was effective in the plan before 3/11 that has been after the 3/11.
That makes sense. This is going to be our final question, and we're going to bring it to the local level. Based on what you know about Portland and the local governments, what do you think are the most important things the city still has to do to prepare for a Cascadia earthquake?
That's a hard one. Hiro, pick it up.
Yes, one of the video clips I saw this morning that was commemorating the 3/11 earthquake. The city mayor of some city in Tohoku was being asked the same kind of question. And what he said is that it's going to be very difficult to create or redevelop the community after the disaster, because usually the communication may not happen as smoothly as you want. Therefore, it is always good to have more communication and more smooth communication between the residents and the city, so that once something happens, the communication can take place more effectively and efficiently. So I think that could be one answer to that question.
I think there are many things that probably has to put in place, but another thing that came to my mind was to routinize the evacuation drill among the general public. So some of the things that we noticed and we heard was that the school, except for a few schools that had some victims, I think that's just one who had a major death. But most of the schools, when the school took the students into an organized evacuation, all the students were saved. So that means that at the school level, they had a routinized drill, they know what to do. Also the same thing at the community level, at the neighborhood level, they knew what to do. So that's something that I don't necessarily see in Portland yet.
Thank you for that. Everyone always wants to know how we can translate our lessons learned from cases to here at home. So thanks for taking that. I really appreciate everybody's wonderful questions to today. And let us all thank our speakers one more time, Dr. Nishishiba and Dr. Ito, for a wonderful talk in part 3 of our Toward Resilient Futures speaker series. Please join us on April 8th for our next talk, which will be shared by Brianne Soldovsky and Lauren Frank in the Communication Department. And those will be Communicating Science and Risk and Communicating Health and Risk. You can find the recordings for all of our previous talks as the speaker series on the registration link that you use to register for each talk. The videos are posted there. And if you're interested in more information on any of the EMCR programs, please check the chat, which has the links to all of the websites where you can find out more information. Thank you again to our speakers, and we look forward to seeing you on April 8th. See you soon.